I still remember the sound, the sharp crack of my .50 caliber guns cutting through the morning air, the trembling in my gloves as the recoil ran up my arms, and then, for a moment, the impossible silence that followed. July 2nd, 1943, Castelvetrono Airfield, Sicily. The sun was merciless, turning the sea below into a sheet of molten silver, and somewhere ahead, a German Focke-Wulf 190 banked too late. I squeezed the trigger again, watched the tracer rounds walk up his fuselage, and saw smoke bloom from the belly of his plane. He spiraled down in a trail of black flame, disappearing into the olive fields. That was the moment history shifted, though none of us understood it then. I was only 22, a kid from Brazil, Indiana, sitting inside a P-40 Leaders Warhawk whose wings rattled like an old train. My name was Charles B. Hall, and when my wheels touched back down, the airfield exploded in shouts. Mechanics, cooks, clerks, men who had been mocked and dismissed for years, dropped their tools and ran toward me. We had done what the world said we couldn't. A black pilot had shot down one of Hitler's best. The swastika painted on my Warhawk that afternoon would be the first of many, the start of a ledger that would one day read 112 enemy aircraft destroyed by men. The Germans themselves would come to call Schwarze, Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. But that morning, I didn't think about nicknames or numbers. I thought about the years it had taken to reach that cockpit, about every headline back home insisting people like me were unfit to fight, every white officer who looked through us as if we were invisible. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing into the Sicilian sky believed that same lie, that black men were less than human, incapable of courage or discipline. They were about to learn otherwise. The air smelled of cordite and dust. My plane's engine coughed, leaking oil from a burst line, and I sat there watching smoke rise in the distance, the remains of the Focke-Wulf still burning. Someone slapped my shoulder, yelling, "You got him, Hall! You got the bastard!" But I couldn't even smile yet. Part of me couldn't believe it had happened. Part of me was afraid it would be dismissed, that someone would say I imagined it, because in our world, proof never seemed to be enough. Later that night, when the heat finally broke, we gathered in the mess tent. No brass, no reporters, just the 99th's men, sharing rations and quiet pride. One mechanic, a kid from Chicago, kept staring at me like I was some kind of miracle. "Sir," he said softly, "you gave us an answer." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We didn't realize we were standing at the threshold of something bigger than a single dogfight. That little airstrip in Sicily was where Nazi ideology met its contradiction in fire and metal. For years, they had printed charts and lectures proving our inferiority, calling us Untermensch, subhuman. But that day, one of their own elite pilots had fallen to the guns of a man they said could never fly. I often think about the irony. The same people who built their empire on hate were undone by a handful of men from Alabama, Chicago, and Harlem, men who had learned to fly in rickety trainers at Tuskegee, men who carried both the flag and the burden of a race. When our bullets tore through that German plane, we weren't just fighting fascists. We were fighting centuries of disbelief. That night, the base fell quiet again. Out beyond the hangars, the Mediterranean wind pushed through the palms, and I could hear laughter drifting from the tents. It wasn't the laughter of arrogance, it was relief, release, a taste of vindication. We knew the road ahead would be brutal, that this single kill wouldn't erase the barriers around us. But it was proof, hard, undeniable proof, that our wings could burn holes through prejudice itself. In that silence, I wrote a few words in my flight log: enemy destroyed, mission complete. What I didn't write, what no official report could ever capture, was how it felt to look down through the smoke and see the impossible finally give way. Long before any of us ever touched a control stick, the war had already begun, not in the skies over Europe, but in the quiet rooms of Washington and the backyards of Black America. where boys like me stared up at the contrails and wondered why the sky belonged only to others. In 1925, a report from the U.S. Army War College declared that the Negro man was inherently weak in character and inferior in mentality. I remember seeing a copy years later, yellowed and brittle, its words still able to wound. They said we lacked courage, discipline, and intelligence, that we were unfit for technical work or command. It wasn't just an insult, it was law, disguised as logic. That report hung like a ceiling above every dream a young black man could have. But while the military clung to its prejudice, something else was stirring. In the quiet corners of Chicago, a man named William Coffey opened a flight school where we could learn what America refused to teach us. Bessie Coleman, a woman who had to go all the way to France just to get her license, became a symbol to every child who ever pressed a face against a window and watched the sky. And Eugene Bullard, the first black fighter pilot, flew for France in the Great War because his own country wouldn't let him. Their names passed through our communities like secret passwords, proof that courage didn't come in colors. When the clouds of another world war began to gather, the hypocrisy of it all became unbearable. The newspapers asked what our elders whispered every night: how can America fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? Walter White, of the NAACP, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, Judge William H. Hasty, they fought not with rifles, but with petitions and persistence. Their voices battered the doors of the War Department until something finally cracked. April 3, 1939, Public Law 18. Buried inside its language was a single amendment: the government would train Negro air pilots. It sounded like progress, but to us it was more like a dare. The military called it an experiment to see if we could be trained, as if courage were a chemical that might not react in darker skin. By the time Franklin Roosevelt ran for a third term, he needed black votes in northern cities. Promises turned into programs, and on January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson announced the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. That's how Tuskegee came to life, out in the red Alabama dust where nothing seemed to move except the wind. I still remember the first day there. The air smelled of pine and oil, rows of trainers lined up like fragile bones, their propellers catching the morning light. The white instructors stood off to one side, arms crossed, watching us climb into cockpits as if waiting for us to fail. But failure wasn't an option. Every mistake we made would become ammunition for those waiting to shut the program down. So we studied until our eyes burned. We flew until our fingers blistered. We learned every bolt, every vibration, every sound an engine could make when it was about to die. And above all, we learned silence, the silence of endurance. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. understood that silence better than anyone. The son of America's first black general, he'd spent 4 years at West Point with no one speaking to him except on official duty. They froze him out, hoping to break him. Instead, they forged him. When he walked among us, he didn't need to shout. His very presence said, "If I could survive that, you can survive this." We were 20, maybe 21, carrying the expectations of 13 million Americans who had never seen a man like them fly a fighter plane. Some nights after the engines went quiet, we'd sit by the airstrip and watch the stars blink above Alabama. Someone would hum a tune, "Take the A train." Maybe, and for a little while, we'd forget that the rest of the country thought we were a joke. Then morning came, and with it, the roar of the trainers. Dust would rise around us like fog, and the sun would climb hot and hard. One by one, we'd take off men the Army had labeled unsuitable and paint circles into the sky. We didn't know where those circles would lead. We didn't know that one day they would turn into the tight, perfect formations over Italy, or that we'd be asked to guard bombers all the way to Berlin. All we knew was that if we failed, the whole experiment would end, and with it every dream we'd ever had. When Captain Davis assembled us for the final inspection before deployment, he looked at us for a long time and said, "They think this is a test. Let's make sure they never have to run it again." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the war. Because that's what Tuskegee was, a test of endurance, of patience, of worth. And when we finally took off for North Africa, none of us realized that the hardest battles still lay ahead, not against the Germans, but against our own country's disbelief. When we finally crossed the Atlantic, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exile. The 99th Fighter Squadron landed in North Africa in the spring of 1943, a small patch of red earth near Farjuna, Tunisia, where the desert seemed to breathe heat straight through your boots. The sun there wasn't light, it was punishment. It bleached the canvas of our tents, baked the smell of gasoline and sweat into our uniforms, and turned every mission briefing into a contest of endurance. We were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Mollmeyer, a man who didn't hide his contempt. He called us an experiment, but the tone in his voice made it sound more like a joke. He kept us on patrol mission circles over the Mediterranean, far from real combat. Some of the men said he was protecting us. I knew better. He wanted us to fail quietly, to prove his reports right. Our P-40 Warhawks were already old when we got them. They leaked oil, rattled at high altitude, and lost speed against German fighters. Still, they were ours. We'd spent years earning the right to touch those planes, and now we were determined to make them mean something. The first combat mission came on June 2nd, 1943. We were ordered to attack the island of Pantelleria, a volcanic speck held by the Italians. It was supposed to be routine. We climbed through the haze, our formation tight, our stomachs even tighter. Then the call came over the radio: enemy aircraft sighted. Focke-Wulfs, fast and bright against the blue. The first time you see enemy tracers, your mind does strange things. You think of all the drills, all the words your instructors said, but none of it feels real. The sky doesn't care who's trained harder. It just becomes noise and movement and the pounding of your heart. But that day, we held formation. No one broke. No bombers were lost. The Germans peeled away, probably confused, maybe even impressed, that we hadn't scattered. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the beginning of respect. Then came July 2nd. I was there when Hall got his kill over Sicily, his Warhawk diving out of the sun, his rounds ripping through the Focke-Wulf that never saw him coming. When he landed, dust blooming around his tires, we all ran toward him. Someone shouted, "That's one for all of us!" For a few minutes, the war didn't feel so heavy. But the celebration didn't last. Back at headquarters, Colonel Mollmeyer filed a report claiming our squadron lacked aggressiveness. He said we were timid, ineffective words that could end the experiment entirely. We knew what that meant. If the brass believed him, Tuskegee would close, and every pilot waiting in Alabama would go back to polishing other men's shoes. So we fought harder. The missions blurred together, long hours over the sea, escorting bombers through flak storms, diving at trains and convoys, always proving ourselves one sortie at a time. The men stopped thinking about medals. We just wanted to stay in the air. Then, in January 1944, everything changed at Anzio. The Germans had cornered our forces on the beachhead, pounding them day and night. We flew P-42s that could barely keep up, but we went anyway, 15 of us, climbing into a sky already boiling with smoke. That morning, I remember the sea below looked like shattered glass. Radio chatter was chaos. Focke-Wulfs came at us in pairs, sleek and confident. I felt the weight of every doubt ever thrown at us pressing on my shoulders, and then something inside broke. Not fear, but the need to prove anything. I just flew. By the time we landed, the air smelled of cordite and salt. Reports came in. 8, maybe 13 enemy aircraft destroyed over 2 days. Charles Hall claimed 2 more victories. We'd done it flying outdated planes. Under hostile command, we'd matched the best in the Luftwaffe. The War Department couldn't ignore us anymore. They launched a study comparing our record with other P-40 squadrons and discovered what we already knew. We were performing just as well. Maybe better. That night, Captain Davis stood before us under a sky filled with sparks from distant artillery. He didn't smile often, but that night, his voice carried something close to pride. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've proved that courage isn't a matter of color. But remember, they'll try to forget tomorrow. So, we'll remind them again." We knew the fight wasn't over. The next war would be fought not just in the air, but in every report, every rumor, every whispered doubt back home. Yet, as I looked around that dusty field at the men who'd survived their first real taste of battle, at the ground crews, still grinning through exhaustion, I felt something shift. We were no longer an experiment. We were pilots, soldiers, airmen. And though the desert wind would erase our footprints by morning, our names had already been written in the sky above Anzio, in smoke, fire, and the sound of engines that refused to quit. By the time spring came to Italy in 1944, we had stopped asking to be believed. We were done proving. We were ready to fight on our own terms. That was when the 99th joined 3 other squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group, 4 units, 1 soul. It was the birth of what history would call the Red Tails. Ramitelli Airfield sat on the Adriatic coast, a sprawl of mud and wind, the kind of place where everything boots, hands, hearts stayed dirty. But we didn't care. For the first time, we were part of the 15th Air Force, flying out with the big boys, protecting the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds that carried America's war into Germany itself. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood before us that first morning, his uniform immaculate, the sun catching on his wings. "Our job," he said quietly, "is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." There was no applause, no rallying cry, just the sound of engines warming in the distance. But his words stuck. They would define everything that came next. When the order came to mark each fighter group for identification, we were given red, a full crimson tail, bright as blood against the gray sky. The ground crews painted through the night. The air smelled of enamel and gasoline, men laughing softly as they brushed color onto metal. Someone joked, "They'll see us coming from miles away." And someone else answered, "Good. Let them know who's saving their hides." The next morning, under that same pale dawn, the Mustangs gleamed like a promise, sleek, fast, and alive. The first time I sat in one, I could feel the difference immediately. The Packard-built Merlin engine purred like something alive, and when I pushed the throttle forward, the airfield dropped away as if the earth itself were giving us permission. Our reputation spread quietly. Bomber crews didn't know we were black, they just knew the red-tailed fighters never left them, no matter how thick the flak or how tempting the dogfights. "If you can get the red tails," they'd say over briefing tables, "you'll make it home." But the war wasn't sentimental. It tested us again on July 18, 1944, Memmingen, Germany. 66 Mustangs went up under Colonel Davis's command to escort bombers to a Luftwaffe base deep behind enemy lines. The bombers were late. Davis had to choose: turn back or orbit in enemy airspace. He chose to stay. I remember the silence just before the attack, that brief, eerie stillness that comes when even the wind seems to hold its breath. Then the sky filled with Germans. 100 Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts diving out of the sun. It was chaos, engines screaming, tracers streaking across the bombers like fiery spiderwebs. For 20 minutes, we fought in a storm of metal. I saw B-17 seconds burning, parachutes opening like white flowers, and in the middle of it all, the Red Tails held formation. We claimed a dozen enemy fighters that day, but 15 bombers still fell. When we landed, the air was thick with exhaustion and grief. The critics back home pounced on the loss. They said it proved we couldn't handle major combat. But the truth, as the after-action reports showed, was that we'd flown into an impossible trap. The Germans were already there in force before we arrived. If we hadn't been, none of those bombers would have made it home at all. That night, I sat with the crew chiefs outside the tents, watching the last light fade over the Adriatic. One of them, a quiet man named Coleman, spoke without looking at me. "You know," he said, "the more we win, the less they'll want to admit it." I nodded. We both knew he was right. Still, the missions kept coming. Long escort runs through flak-choked skies, our planes trembling from the cold at 30,000 feet, the radio full of static and prayer. Each time we brought the bombers back, we wrote another sentence into history, one that no officer's prejudice could erase. The red tails became our armor, our declaration. To the Germans, it was a mark of death. To the bombers, a sign of salvation. I can still see them, a line of crimson streaks above the clouds, sunlight catching their wings like fire. We had come a long way from the dusty fields of Tuskegee. We no longer needed to ask for a place in the sky. We had taken it, painted it red, and claimed it as our own. By early 1945, the sky over Europe had changed color. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, the Allies were closing in, and yet Germany had unveiled something new, something that made even seasoned pilots like me feel the chill of fear. The Messerschmitt Me 262. A jet fighter, faster than anything, with propellers slicing through the air like lightning. We used to joke that if you blinked, you'd miss it, but no one laughed for long. March 24, 1945. The mission was Berlin, the heart of the Reich. Our orders: escort bombers striking the Daimler-Benz tank works. Colonel Davis himself led 43 of us, the 332nd Fighter Group, into the cold dawn. The air was glassy and thin. Even at altitude, you could feel the tension humming inside every man. We knew we might not come back. The first sign was the radio crackle. "Bandits high, 10 o'clock. Then, specks on the horizon, silver flashes moving faster than our eyes could follow. The Me 262 seconds had arrived. They came in like ghosts, diving at impossible speeds, their cannons thundering before you could line up a shot. I remember Lieutenant Roscoe Brown's voice over the comms, calm as if he were reading the weather. "They're faster, but they still have to turn." He'd studied the jet's blind spots for weeks, memorizing its weaknesses. When one streaked past him, he broke off, rolled, and cut across its arc like a blade. His tracers reached the jet just as it leveled. For a heartbeat, the sky exploded in flame. "I got him!" Brown shouted. The pilots out, "Shoot open." Another jet flashed by me. Lieutenant Earl Lane was chasing it, his voice sharp with effort. 2,000 yards. Deflection shot. We heard his burst 3 clean rounds, and then the Me 262 began to tumble, smoke spiraling behind it like a dark ribbon. By the time Lieutenant Charles Brantley downed the third, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. 3 German jets. Gone. The red tails had done the impossible. When we landed back at Ramitelli, the crews met us with tears and laughter. The air smelled of fuel and victory. Our mission log that day read like a myth: 3 jets destroyed, 0 bombers lost. For that, the 332nd earned the Distinguished Unit Citation. But for us, it was simpler, proof that courage could outfly technology. Not all our battles ended in glory. 32 of our men were captured during the war. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was one of them. He was shot down over southern France while strafing radar sites. When he told his story later, it chilled me. At his interrogation, the German officer knew everything: the number of our planes, our commanders, even Jefferson's parents' names. Their intelligence was terrifying, he said. But what struck him most was how the Germans treated him afterward. In Stalag Luft 3rd, He lived among white American POWs who, for the first time, looked at him without contempt. Here I was, he told me years later, in a Nazi prison camp, being treated more equally than I ever was back home. The irony of it was unbearable. We were fighting monsters abroad, while the country that sent us barely considered us men. When Jefferson returned to America after liberation, the first thing he saw at the disembarkation point was a sign, "Colored personnel, this way." After surviving dogfights, flak, and captivity, segregation still waited for him like an old ghost. Yet even the Germans, those same pilots who once mocked us, had learned to respect the red tails. They called us Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. And the bomber crews, the ones whose lives we guarded through 1,000 storms, had their own name, Red Tail Angels. That's the name that stayed. I used to think about those bombers when I couldn't sleep, the endless drone of their engines, the faces of the men who waved from their gun turrets as we formed up beside them. They didn't care what color we were. All they cared about was getting home. And somehow, that simple faith, their belief that we would always be there, became our purpose. The war was nearly over, but the mission wasn't. Because every time we climbed into those cockpits, we weren't just defending bombers. We were defending a future that still refused to see us. That morning over Berlin, as smoke curled through the clouds and the red tails flashed in the sun, I understood something I hadn't before. We weren't just fighting the Luftwaffe, we were fighting gravity itself. The gravity of history, pulling us down, telling us we didn't belong up there. And we kept flying anyway. When the war ended, we expected to come home to parades, to cheers, maybe even to a country that finally saw us for what we were. Instead, we walked down gangplanks into the same divided America we'd left behind. White pilots went one way. We were pointed toward another gate, another waiting bus marked "Colored Troops Only." Some of the men laughed bitterly, some stared straight ahead, and a few just lowered their heads and whispered, "Nothing's changed." But something had changed in us. We had crossed skies that tried to kill us, faced an enemy that believed we were subhuman, and proved both of them wrong. You can't go through that and come home the same. The record books didn't care about skin color. Numbers told the truth. 15,000 sorties, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, nearly 1,000 rail cars and trucks blown to scrap. Only 27 bombers lost under our escort, nearly half the rate of every other group in the 15th Air Force. Those numbers weren't statistics. They were names, men who had refused to abandon their posts, ground crews who kept us flying with tools older than their planes, engineers who worked through bomb raids to patch our wings before dawn. Still, our names faded from the headlines. The War Department filed away our successes in silence. In the bars and train stations of America, strangers thanked white crews for winning the air war. No one mentioned the Red Tails. The same country that had sent us to fight Hitler's racism couldn't face its own. Lee Archer, one of our finest aces, used to say, "Nobody believes me anyway. A black fighter pilot must be lying." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes stayed tired. For a long time we lived quietly, teachers, postal clerks, mechanics, men who once danced with death above Berlin, now standing in lines at the bank. But the sky never left us. Sometimes, when a plane passed overhead, we'd stop whatever we were doing and just watch until it disappeared. Then, in 1948, came something we never thought we'd see. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, integrating the U.S. military. I still remember the newspaper headline, bold, black letters, that finally sounded like vindication. The Tuskegee Airmen hadn't just fought a war, we had changed one. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., our commander who had once been shunned into silence at West Point, became the first black general in the United States Air Force in 1954. He stood straighter than ever when he pinned that star to his uniform, but those of us who knew him could see the memory behind his eyes, the lonely cadet no one spoke to, the leader who turned silence into discipline, prejudice into purpose. Recognition came slowly, as history always seems to move. Decades later, in 2007, a handful of us old now, our hands trembling, but our backs still straight, stood in the Capitol Rotunda, while President George W. Bush placed the Congressional Gold Medal before us. 300 of us were left. Some wore canes, some wore oxygen tubes, but all of us wore the same quiet pride. I remember looking up at the dome and thinking of the ones who never made it home: 66 killed in combat, 32 captured, 84 lost in training. Their ghosts filled the hall more completely than any applause. The newspapers called it long overdue recognition. I called it justice delayed but not denied. In the years since, I've been asked what we fought for. Was it the country that segregated us? The flag that flew over separate barracks and dining halls? Maybe. But more than that, we fought for the right to belong to the sky, for the belief that ability is not born from color, but from courage. When I close my eyes, I still see the red tails glinting in sunlight, tight formations cutting across a frozen sky. I see the bomber crews waving as we peel away, wings rocking in farewell. I hear the crackle of radios, the tremble of engines, and the voice of Roscoe Brown echoing across the years. We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all three battles. That's the legacy we carried home, proof that the measure of a man isn't in the shade of his skin, but in how high he dares to fly when the world tells him not to. And somewhere, even now, when a jet streaks across a cloudless sky, I like to think a touch of red still lingers in its wake.